The cleaning rota designated the 57th floor as high-priority silent access only, meaning Imani had to rely solely on the hushed whine of the industrial HEPA filter tucked into her cart, avoiding the rhythmic clang of the elevator that might alert the building's skeletal night security. It was 3:17 a.m. in the heart of Toronto's financial district, and the glass wall of the penthouse office offered a cold, sprawling view of Lake Ontario, mirroring the cold dread that usually settled in Imani's gut. Her hands, habitually wrapped in thin blue latex, moved with the precision of a surgeon, wiping down the vast obsidian desk belonging to Mr. Ji-hoon Lee, the invisible, untouchable force who owned this entire floor, and reputedly half a dozen shadow corporations. She paused, the scent of specialized wood polish stinging her nostrils, noticing a minute, almost imperceptible scratch near the corner of the desk's leather inlay. Habit took over, as she pressed lightly, searching for the source. Of the imperfection, a hidden mechanism clicked softly, the sound absorbed instantly by the dense carpet. A shallow compartment slid open, revealing not the expected documents or weapons, but two items laid side by side. A sleek, military-grade satellite phone, still warm to the touch, and a heavy sealed manila envelope marked only with a stylized, unreadable Korean character. Imani's heart, usually a steady, exhausted drum, skipped several beats. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, listening intently for the distant murmur of traffic or the HVAC system, but hearing nothing save the frantic pulse in her own ears. Her hands, still encased in the protective plastic, trembled slightly as she hesitated. Her employment contract explicitly warned against looking, touching, or acknowledging anything outside the bounds of sanitation. But the profound, gnawing emptiness she carried, the recent brutal confirmation from St. Jude's Clinic that her body simply could not carry life, drove a curiosity stronger than fear. With a swift, desperate motion, she lifted the envelope. The paper inside was thick and expensive. It wasn't cash. It was a stack of highly sensitive medical diagnostic reports. Scrawled across the top page, beside a complex genetic sequencing chart, was the name Ji-hoon Lee, and below it, circled in thick red ink, the stark, devastating word she knew too well from her own files: oligospermia, infertility, the ruthlessly powerful, feared man who controlled. Life and death in the city was, biologically, unable to perpetuate his own bloodline. The shock of this shared secret shame, this intimate, crippling failure, pulsed through Imani, bridging the chasm between her 15-hour existence and his high-rise empire. She quickly tucked the envelope back, snapping the compartment shut, just as the faint, distinct sound of an elevator ascending began to filter through the thick walls. He was coming back, the distant, nearly inaudible chime of the private express elevator chimed a second time, signifying the 55th floor. Imani, scrambling away from the desk, felt the latex gloves sticking uncomfortably to the slight dampness on her palms. She shoved the cart silently into the hallway alcove, her movements a practiced ballet of invisibility honed over years of working the graveyard shift. The fluorescent hallway lights hummed with a low, vibrating drone, illuminating the polished marble floor tiles that reflected her wide, terrified eyes, back at her, sir. Her internal clock screamed two conflicting narratives. Run, get out before he sees you, and stay, finish the job, don't give him a reason to notice the missing 2 minutes. The manila envelope, resting back in its hidden slot, felt like a physical weight against her own chest, pressing against the scar tissue of her failed dreams. Infertility. The word resonated with the sharp, metallic tang of shared vulnerability. It was the only language, she realized, that could possibly exist. Between the invisible cleaning lady and the untouchable mogul, a secret lexicon of broken futures. She had always viewed Mr. Lee as a monolith of absolute power, a being whose life was devoid of common human failure. This revelation stripped him naked in her eyes, exposing a profound, unexpected fragility that complicated her fear with a strange, aching pity. She reached for the window cleaning apparatus, a long telescopic pole, concentrating fiercely on the rhythmic squeak of the rubber blade. Against the cold glass, Her focus, usually laser-sharp, was fractured by the knowledge she now possessed. She could smell the expensive, heavy scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and ozone, drifting down the hallway even before his figure materialized. It was a smell that denoted wealth, but now to her it was tainted by the sterile scent of the medical reports she had just glimpsed. Mr. Lee Ji-hoon stepped out of the elevator's silver cage. He wasn't dressed in the customary tailored suit. Instead, he wore heavy, dark wool trousers and a cashmere sweater that suggested late-night operational urgency rather than leisure. His face, usually a mask of chilling indifference, was taut, the shadows under his eyes pronounced under the harsh office lighting. His gaze swept the hallway, not resting on Imani but through her, assessing the environment for threats. His hands, large and impeccably manicured, were conspicuously empty, though the subtle, taut set of his shoulders indicated an underlying readiness for conflict. Imani held her breath, the window squeegee frozen mid-wipe, transforming herself into a non-entity, a mere fixture of the office landscape, praying he wouldn't notice the faint, lingering scent of wood polish she had just applied to his desk. The silence stretched thick and suffocating until he finally turned and moved into the deeper recesses of the penthouse, towards a hidden door she knew led to the private residence. Ji-hoon disappeared behind the heavy, sound-dampened door to his residential suite. Imani let out a slow, shaky breath, the residual tension in her shoulders refusing to dissipate entirely. She restarted the deliberate scraping motion of the squeegee against the immense window pane, the repetitive action a necessary anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. The contrast between her reality and his was a physical ache. She was scrubbing glass for minimum wage, dreaming of a family she couldn't have, while he commanded empires. From a penthouse haunted by the very same biological failure, the sheer irony felt like a cruel joke played by the universe. As she worked the periphery of the office, wiping down the minimalist side tables and rearranging the precisely aligned art books, Imani's internal narrative intensified. She was 32 black, working 3 different cleaning contracts just to keep her small apartment in subsidized housing, a world away from the gleaming steel and marble of this domain. For years, she had fought the despair of her diagnosis, clinging to the hope that adoption or fostering might one day fill the void. Yet, the sting of being unable to conceive her own child remained a dull, constant ache. Now she knew this powerful, intimidating man shared that pain, though his wealth cushioned him from the economic cruelty that accompanied her own diagnosis. Could money solve every problem but this one? She wondered if he felt the same crushing inadequacy, the same fear that his legacy, his very purpose, was being denied by a silent, microscopic error in his DNA. The silence of the office now seemed hostile, thick with unspoken secrets. Imani moved her hand across a dark leather armchair, meticulously removing a barely visible speck of dust. She noticed a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her own left hand, a nervous tick she usually managed to suppress. She realized that knowing his vulnerability was perhaps more dangerous than knowing his crimes. Vulnerability, particularly, in a man of his stature, was a weapon that could backfire catastrophically if exposed. She quickly dismissed the intrusive thought that she could use this information. The risk was too astronomical. Her survival depended on her invisibility, her silence. She caught a fleeting reflection of herself in the polished surface of a cabinet, a tired woman in ill-fitting scrubs, a small, dark figure dwarfed by the opulence and height. The ambient sounds outside, the faint, distant wail of a police siren, filtering up from the streets 18 stories below, the occasional rumble of a subway train, served as a reminder of the real world she occupied, the world outside this gilded cage of power and pain. Her job was nearly done. She had to gather her supplies and retreat, before the first hint of pre-dawn light began to soften the stark edges of the cityscape. She pushed her cart with exaggerated care, rolling the silent rubber wheels toward the service elevator, her mind obsessively reviewing every micro-action of the last 10 minutes, desperate to find reassurance that she had left no trace of her transgression. Imani reached the service elevator bay, a colder, less ostentatious area of the floor dominated by bare concrete and exposed utility piping. As she pressed the call button, she heard a sound that instantly stiffened her spine. Not the expected ding of the arriving elevator, but the click of the residential door opening again. She didn't turn around. She maintained her posture, back to the office, staring at the illuminated up arrow on the elevator panel, willing the cage to arrive faster than physically possible. She could hear the heavy, deliberate steps on the carpeted floor approaching the main desk area. She focused on the faint, high-pitched whine that the old service motor made when starting its ascent from the parking garage, treating it like a lifeline. Her hands gripped the stainless steel handle of her cleaning cart so tightly the thin blue latex threatened to tear. She felt a palpable pressure increase in the air as Ji-hoon stopped directly behind her, close enough that she could smell the complex, layered scent of his expensive cologne mixed with something sharper, perhaps a faint metallic scent she couldn't immediately identify. Wait. The single word, spoken in a low, gravelly tenor, was not a question, but an absolute command. It cut through the ambient hum of the building, freezing Imani in place. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird desperate for release. She knew she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard him. She slowly turned, maintaining a professionally blank expression, her eyes lowered instinctively to the knot of his chest, avoiding direct eye contact. This was the first time he had ever acknowledged her existence in months of silent shared space. Ji-hoon stood just 3 feet away, his expression unreadable, though his jaw was set with a tension that spoke of contained frustration. He didn't look angry, but intensely focused, like a predator assessing a small necessary obstacle. His left hand was tucked into the pocket of his dark trousers. His right hand was resting lightly on the edge of the service desk. He was listening, not to her, but to the deep, layered silence of the vast office space. He knew the building's acoustic profile intimately, and he was searching for any disruption, any lingering sign that the silent rules had been broken. Imani could feel the heat radiating off him, the sheer intensity of his presence overwhelming the small utility corner. She forced herself to speak, the sound of her voice thin and slightly tremulous, the professionalism strained by the adrenaline rush. "Is there something else you require, Mr. Lee? I believe the deep sanitation cycle is complete for this floor." Her hands, she noted, were still gripping the cart handle, preventing them from betraying her nervousness with excessive movement. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, his dark eyes, after sweeping the room one final time, finally settled on her face. Not her eyes, but the small telltale droplets of perspiration clinging to her hairline beneath the tightly pulled ponytail. He was observing her physical reaction to his presence, measuring her fear, her exhaustion. He knew with the chilling certainty of a man used to observing fear that she was profoundly uneasy. The prolonged silence stretched into an eternity, punctuated only by the distant, slow grinding of the arriving service elevator motor getting closer. The service elevator finally arrived with a gentle thud and the soft hiss of the hydraulic door opening, an invitation to escape that Imani desperately wanted to accept. But she remained rooted, held fast by the intensity of Ji-hoon's gaze. He took a single measured step closer, effectively blocking her path into the elevator cage without touching her. His eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, finally met hers, a direct confrontation that shattered the comfortable anonymity she had always relied upon. "The desktop polish," he stated, his voice still low, almost a whisper, yet vibrating with controlled authority. "The scent is too strong tonight. It lingers. I specified minimal odor." Imani felt a sudden rush of defensive anger, quickly suppressed. She used the standard unscented industrial grade supplied by the cleaning company. But arguing with the owner of the building, especially one who doubled as a crime boss, was not an advisable career move. She dipped her head slightly, a gesture of deference that cost her dearly. "My apologies, Mr. Lee. I will switch to the non-volatile compound immediately. It won't happen again." She watched his hands. His right hand still rested on the desk, fingers splayed slightly. She noticed a faint, almost invisible white residue clinging to the pad of his thumb, a residue that looked precisely like the pharmaceutical powder residue she had accidentally spilled once while cleaning a medicine cabinet years ago. Her mind made an immediate chilling jump. painkillers, stress medication, or perhaps something illicit related to the nature of his business. The micro-detail deepened the complexity of the man standing before her. He straightened slightly, the movement conveying both impatience and a predatory calm. "You work this floor every night. For how long?" "8 months, sir," she replied, keeping her answers concise and devoid of emotion. Her hands were now resting lightly on the cart handle, preventing any involuntary fidgeting. The only sounds were the slow ventilation system and the faint, barely perceptible hum of the building's massive infrastructure. He tilted his head, a small assessing gesture. "You are efficient, quiet, unlike the others." He didn't offer this as a compliment, merely a statement of fact observed. "I am expecting a guest soon. A discreet delivery." He didn't elaborate on the nature of the delivery, nor did she press him. "I need complete assurance that this floor from now until the end of your contract remains absolutely sterile. Not just clean, sterile. Any deviation, any observation noted outside of your sanctioned duties will be immediately reported." He didn't need to finish the threat. Imani understood the consequences of reporting in his world. It wouldn't mean a pink slip. It meant vanishing. She met his gaze, holding it just long enough to convey sincerity, masking the terror that was churning in her stomach. "Understood, Mr. Lee. I am invisible here. I see nothing." The irony was painful. She had just seen the most personal, devastating piece of information about him. Ji-hoon gave the slightest of nods, his expression unchanged. He stepped back, the tension in his frame relaxing marginally, signaling the end of the interrogation. The service elevator door remained open, waiting. "Go." Imani pushed her cart quickly into the elevator. As the doors began to glide shut, she managed one last, fleeting glance at Ji-hoon. He was walking directly back towards his desk, his eyes already fixed on the exact spot where the hidden compartment containing his medical secret lay. The gancho chocante had been set. The elevator descended slowly, the movement a palpable release of the suffocating pressure she had endured. Imani leaned against the cold metal wall, letting out the breath she felt she had been holding since she first opened that secret compartment. She watched the floor numbers drop, 56, 55, 54, each digit a meter of safety gained. The air in the service shaft smelled stale and metallic, a sharp contrast to the purified, expensive air of the penthouse. Her hands, still gloved, were shaking violently now that the immediate threat was gone. She peeled off the latex, the sound of faint ripping tear in the quiet cabin, and shoved them into the disposal sack attached to her cart. The physical act of removing the gloves felt like shedding a layer of armor. She looked down at her skin, focusing on the dark color of her knuckles, trying to ground herself in the reality of her own existence, far removed from the golden cage above. Oligospermia. The word kept cycling through her mind, not as a threat, but as a connection, a shared wound. It was a bizarre, fragile bridge built across the vast social and racial gulf that separated them. Imani knew the emotional toll of that diagnosis, the crushing weight of biological failure, the way it made you question your very purpose. She understood the intense secrecy that would surround such a vulnerability, for a man whose power was based entirely on the image of unassailable strength and generational continuity. For a mafia boss, the inability to produce an heir could be a fatal weakness, both politically and socially within his own highly traditional culture. When the elevator reached the subterranean loading dock, the cacophony of the city's early morning logistics, the distant beep-beep-beep of reversing sanitation trucks, the low rumble of massive diesel engines, and the high-pitched shriek of compressed air brakes, slammed into her senses. This was her world, noisy, gritty, and real. She pushed her heavy cart across the cracked concrete floor toward the time clock, the sound of the hard plastic wheels rattling loudly, a comforting contrast to the unnatural silence of the upper floors. She clocked out at 4:11 a.m. The time card registered her 20-minute deviation from her usual exit time, a minor anomaly that would usually go unnoticed by the automated system. But tonight everything felt observed. As she walked towards the back entrance, the cold, pre-dawn air hitting her face, she mentally rehearsed her journey home. Streetcar, transfer to the bus, 45 minutes of bone-aching exhaustion before she could collapse into bed for a scant 3 hours of sleep before her second shift. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her chest, the material offering little defense against the Canadian chill. The realization hit her with renewed force. She was carrying a secret that could destroy one of the most powerful men in the city, a man who, ironically, was suffering the same quiet heartbreak as she was. It changed everything. Her fear was still paramount, but it was now threaded with a dangerous, burgeoning sense of empathy, a feeling that she was no longer just the invisible servant, but the silent, reluctant witness to his private tragedy. Imani walked quickly along the dimly lit alleyway. Behind the skyscraper, the massive granite walls looming over her like silent, cold sentinels, the light pollution of the city created a pale, orange halo in the sky, a false dawn that promised no true warmth. The rubber soles of her work boots squeaked softly on the damp pavement, the only sound apart from the distant urban grind. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the few other early risers, mostly delivery drivers and fellow service workers who shared this shadow world. The transition from the sterile, hushed perfection of the 57th floor to the harsh, raw reality of the street was always jarring. Up there, life was controlled, contained, and filtered. Down here, it was messy, struggling, and immediate. The sheer weight of the wealth she had just left behind pressed down on her, magnifying her own struggle. She thought of her small, cluttered kitchen, the chipped formica countertop, the constant battle against the damp in the basement apartment. Ji-hoon's kitchen, she imagined, was probably larger than her entire living space, filled with appliances she couldn't name. And yet, the fundamental biological imperative, the desire for a child, for continuity, was the great equalizer. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, walking past a dumpster overflowing with discarded cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of rotten fruit. She remembered the consultation with Dr. Alistair at the clinic just 6 weeks ago, the gentle but firm delivery of the news that her own history of severe endometriosis had rendered her uterus incapable of carrying a pregnancy to term. The grief had been suffocating, compounded by the constant financial strain that made private fertility treatments a cruel impossibility. She reached the Main Street intersection, waiting impatiently for the walk signal. The bus stop bench was cold, and she sat gingerly, pulling her collar up. She pulled out her worn, scratched smartphone, checking the time, and then quickly navigating to her bank balance, a ritual born of anxiety. The numbers were meager but stable. It was enough for rent, enough for food, but light years away from affording a house or even beginning the laborious and expensive process of adoption paperwork. A sleek, black European sedan, silent and imposing, slid past the curb and stopped 20 feet down the street. It was too pristine for a taxi, too deliberate for a random luxury car. Imani's muscles tensed instinctively. Her gaze darted to the tinted windows, but she could see nothing inside. She told herself it was paranoia, an overreaction fueled by the terrifying encounter with Ji-hoon. But in this city, in this hour, such cars usually meant business, his kind of business. She pretended to be utterly absorbed in her phone, scrolling through old irrelevant news articles while every sensory input was screaming a warning. She waited for the bus, the air thick with the unspoken, invisible surveillance of Toronto's dark underbelly. The gancho had now introduced the threat of direct contact and the deepening empathy of shared failure. The black sedan remained stationary, its engine an almost silent purr that was nonetheless loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Imani's streetcar arrived first, a rattling, brightly lit behemoth that offered a temporary sense of security. She stood immediately, avoiding any glance towards the car, and stepped onto the streetcar, swiping her transit pass with a mechanical efficiency that masked her rising dread. She chose a seat near the middle, away from the doors where she could watch the street without seeming obvious. As the streetcar pulled away with a screech of metal on metal, she risked a look back. The black sedan was still there, but now the front passenger window was partially rolled down. She didn't see a face, but she saw a flash of silver, the unmistakable gleam of a high-end watch catching the artificial light of the street lamps. The car didn't follow the streetcar immediately. It remained paused, like a silent hunter calculating its trajectory. This was no coincidence. She was being watched, assessed, monitored. The encounter with Ji-hoon Lee had shattered her long-cultivated invisibility. Whether he suspected she knew about his medical reports or simply deemed her a potential security leak following his urgent late-night arrival, the fact remained. She was now a variable in his meticulous, dangerous equation. The thought sent a cold dread through her veins, a stark reminder that in his world, variables were eliminated, not managed. She pulled out her work-issued earpiece, pretending to listen to a podcast, but really straining her ears for any abnormal sounds inside the moving streetcar. The smells were distinctly urban: stale coffee, damp wool, and the faint chemical scent of disinfectant clinging to the transit seats. Her small, mundane life, usually a fortress of routine and predictability, suddenly felt exposed and fragile. The streetcar continued its journey south, descending into the older, more working-class neighborhoods. Imani exited at her usual transfer point, the corner dominated by an all-night diner whose neon sign cast a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. She walked briskly to the bus shelter, the cold digging deeper into her bones. She couldn't shake the image of the silver watch flashing in the dark car. It was an expensive watch, the kind that cost more than her annual salary, a minute detail that spoke volumes about the resources dedicated to tracking her. When the bus arrived, it was the final leg home. As she settled into her seat, she finally allowed herself to analyze the situation with chilling clarity. Ji-hoon had sought assurance of her silence. That assurance was not enough. He needed absolute certainty, and for men like him, certainty often meant control. She realized that her perceived neutrality, her quiet efficiency, had inadvertently transformed her from a ghost into a strategic point of interest. Her life was about to become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The realization cemented the fact that the two worlds, the penthouse and the pavement, were no longer separate, but violently colliding. The bus trip lasted 45 minutes, winding through side streets and housing projects. By the time Imani reached her stop, the first weak light of dawn was attempting to pierce the heavy cloud cover, casting the world in a dreary grey. She stepped off the bus, her legs stiff from exhaustion, the chill of the morning seeping through her worn denim. Her apartment building, a squat brick structure built in the 1970s, looked particularly dismal under the nascent light. As she fumbled with her keys at the exterior door, the familiar scent of stale cooking oil and disinfectant that clung to the communal hallway walls was oddly comforting. It was the smell of her life, predictable and poor, but safe. She climbed the creaking wooden stairs to her basement apartment, avoiding the loose step on the third riser that always threatened to buckle. Once inside her small unit, she locked the 3 separate deadbolts with ritualistic slowness. The silence here was different from the penthouse's sterile quiet. This was the quiet of small spaces and thick curtains meant to block out the noise of the street above. She dropped her work bag on the linoleum floor with a weary sigh. The first order of business was to strip off her uniform. The pale green scrubs felt contaminated, imbued with the residue of the penthouse's secrets. She immediately threw them into the washing machine, setting the cycle to the hottest wash possible, a symbolic attempt to cleanse herself of the night's events. While the machine began its noisy, churning work, the rhythmic slosh and spin a familiar soundtrack to her mornings, she moved into the kitchen. She brewed a strong cup of instant coffee, the cheap, bitter aroma filling the air. She sat down at her small, rickety kitchen table, the plastic legs slightly uneven, and stared out the small high window that offered a view only of a sliver of concrete wall and the occasional passing foot. She cradled the warm mug in her hands, focusing on the simple, immediate sensation of heat against her cold skin. Her mind inevitably returned to the diagnosis she shared with Ji-hoon. She retrieved her own faded medical folder from a box beneath her bed, the one she rarely looked at, guarded by layers of fear and denial. She pulled out the summary sheet, running her finger over the printed words. Incapacity to conceive. The details were different, hers rooted in damage, his in biology, but the ultimate result was the same, a profound, unfillable void. What kind of power did this shared secret grant her? None, she immediately countered, if she valued her life. But the sheer symmetry of the situation was arresting. The cleaning lady, sterilized by poverty and illness, and the crime boss, sterilized by genetics. Two ships passing. In the night, linked by the most fundamental human tragedy. This empathy, this dangerous thread of understanding, was the insidious seed that had been planted. It was the first terrifying crack in her rigid wall of self-preservation, signaling the move from gancho to the approfondimento do mundo, where her routine would be violently dismantled. The world had just gotten infinitely smaller. The scent of the cheap coffee did little to fully wake Imani, but the caffeine provided a necessary jolt to her frayed nerves. She needed to transition now, from the trauma of the night shift to the mundanity of her day. She drank the coffee quickly, the bitterness stinging her throat, and then moved to her small bedroom to prepare for her second job, working as a cashier at a downtown market, catering primarily to high-end clientele. Ironically, the same demographic that occupied the tower she cleaned. As she pulled on a heavy sweater and jeans, she noticed the red light blinking on her answering machine, a relic of technology she kept mostly because it was cheap and reliable. It was the landline, unconnected to her mobile phone, and the light meant someone had called while she was gone. She pressed the play button, the tape whirring loudly before a familiar, strained voice filled the cramped space. "Imani, it's Marie. You need to call me. It's about your hours at the center. It's urgent." Marie was her supervisor at the Women's Community Center, where Imani volunteered 2 evenings a week, a lifeline of meaningful work that contrasted sharply with her cleaning and cashier gigs. The urgency in Marie's voice was unusual, tight with concern, not routine scheduling issues. She made the call immediately. Marie picked up on the first ring, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Imani, thank God. Look, I don't know who called, but someone offered a significant, anonymous donation, a large, 6-figure sum, on the absolute condition that we agree to partner with a new, private security consultancy they recommended." Marie paused, a nervous intake of breath audible over the line. "They are demanding a full sweep of all our records and a restructuring of all personnel, and they specifically asked for you to be elevated to a paid full-time administrative position, starting immediately, overseeing the security integration. It's 5 times your current wages." Imani felt the blood drain from her face. The phone nearly slipped from her numb fingers. The speed, the scale, and the specificity of the offer were terrifying. This was Ji-Hoon Lee's style of control, not a direct threat, but an overwhelming offer that reshaped her entire reality, effectively placing her under his immediate, silent patronage. He wasn't just observing her, he was buying her. The promotion and the financial security were the golden handcuffs. The security consultancy was his surveillance system. She leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, the ceramic tiles cold against her cheek. This wasn't the slow, creeping danger she had anticipated. This was a violent, immediate co-option of her life. He wasn't giving her a chance to be invisible again. He was making her important, visible, and utterly dependent. The silence on the phone line stretched, the only sound the distant grinding of the washing machine. This was the approfondimento do mundo, the deliberate shattering of her established boundaries, ensuring that her life and his were now inextricably, dangerously linked. Imani struggled to keep her voice steady, forcing a tone of professional incredulity. "Marie, that's unbelievable. A full-time role? Why me? I'm a volunteer. I have no administrative background." She knew the answer, a terrifying certainty cold as ice in her stomach. But she had to maintain the facade of naive surprise. Marie's voice softened with genuine excitement, interpreting Imani's hesitation as overwhelmed disbelief. "That's what's so bizarre. The donor, or his representative who spoke on the phone, said you were chosen because of your proven discretion and exemplary work ethic in high-pressure environments. They specifically praised your ability to manage multiple complex, sensitive tasks simultaneously. They didn't even ask for a CV, just name confirmation. Discretion and high-pressure environments. This was not a reference to her volunteer work or her cashier job. This was a direct, coded acknowledgement of her nightly surveillance of the 57th floor and her silence following the brief confrontation. Ji-hoon was using the language of her job description to justify her acquisition. The mention of multiple complex, sensitive tasks was a veiled warning, reminding her that he knew everything about her life, including the 2 other jobs she desperately held. They also mentioned, Marie continued, the sound of paperwork rustling in the background, that this new role would require you to be highly accessible. They've secured a furnished, modern studio apartment closer to the downtown core, covering all utilities, to ensure you can commute efficiently for the center's expanded operational hours. Imani, this is a literal miracle. No more commuting from the basement apartment. This solves everything. A new apartment, closer to the city center, closer to him. It wasn't a promotion, it was relocation to a controlled environment. Imani's initial shock gave way to a calculating fear. If she accepted, she would gain unprecedented financial stability and the ability to finally contribute meaningfully to the community she cared about. But she would also trade her freedom for a cage of gold, watched by the security consultancy, which she could only assume was a front for Ji-hoon's organized crime network. Her life would become a performance, perpetually under the lens of the man whose most devastating secret she possessed. She took a deep breath, the coffee mug now cool in her hands. The image of the black sedan with the flashing silver watch returned. She knew declining was an option, but the refusal would be interpreted as resistance, which would likely escalate the danger from surveillance to swift, violent elimination. Acceptance, however, provided protection, proximity, and an opportunity to understand the source of her danger. It was the only viable path to survival, a terrifying surrender disguised as a monumental opportunity. "Marie," Imani said, the decision solidifying in the pit of her stomach. "Tell. Them I accept, but I need to understand the full scope of this security integration immediately. I want the details in writing before I vacate my current roles." She was delaying, buying herself precious hours to prepare, to sever her past ties and assume her new perilous identity. The trap was sprung, and now she had to learn how to live inside its gleaming, dangerous confines. Imani spent the remainder of the morning in a frantic, organized effort to dismantle her life. The euphoria of the financial relief was completely overshadowed by the cold, calculating dread of becoming a kept asset. She called the manager of the downtown market, citing a sudden, severe family emergency requiring her to quit immediately. The manager, predictably, was annoyed but replaceable. She sent a text to her cleaning supervisor, stating that she was resigning from the entire contract, effective immediately. This severed the immediate link to the 57th floor, but also confirmed to Ji-hoon that she was preparing for the transition he had engineered. The new apartment, she learned from an email Marie forwarded, was located in a sleek, anonymous high-rise only 3 blocks from the financial district, placing her firmly in the geographic orbit of Ji-hoon's power. She was given an electronic key fob and told that a liaison would meet her there at 6 p.m. This was her new timeline. She had 8 hours to pack her entire existence into boxes. Her meager possessions filled only 4 cardboard boxes. As she folded her clothes, mostly practical dark items chosen for their anonymity, she felt a profound sense of loss, not for the objects themselves, but for the hard-won independence they represented. This basement apartment, despite its faults, had been hers alone. The new studio would be clean, modern, and undoubtedly bugged. She paused, staring at the only item she hesitated to pack, a small ceramic elephant given to her by her mother, a symbol of good luck and maternal strength. She held the cool, smooth ceramic in her hands, her thumbs tracing the delicate painted patterns. She considered leaving it behind, minimizing anything that could be used as emotional leverage, but the pull of sentiment was too strong. She wrapped it carefully in a heavy wool scarf and placed it in the box labeled Essentials. The hours crawled by, filled with the exhausting physical labor of moving and the intense mental strain of strategic planning. She ate a single dry piece of toast and drank water, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to handle anything more substantial. She spent 40 minutes meticulously cleaning the basement apartment, a deeply ingrained habit. She wanted to leave no trace, no reason for anyone to seek her out here again, creating a vacuum where she used to be. At 5:30 p.m., a white, unmarked moving van arrived. The two men who handled her few boxes were professional, silent, and entirely too large for the job. They loaded her life in under 10 minutes. As she watched the van pull away, leaving her standing alone on the damp street corner, Imani felt the terrifying finality of the move. She was severing all her anchors, pushing off from the known shore, and sailing directly toward the dangerous currents controlled by Ji-hoon Lee. The world had tightened around her, and the next encounter would not be accidental but deliberate and defining. She hailed a taxi, providing the address of her gilded cage, ready to meet the liaison, ready for the world to continue unfolding its dangerous secrets. The taxi ride was short but expensive, a small jarring reminder of her new economic reality. Imani watched the towering glass structures of the financial district grow larger as they approached, their windows glowing with the cool blue-white light of high-efficiency LEDs. The taxi dropped her off in front of a building that radiated exclusivity, its entrance manned by a uniformed, impossibly stiff doorman who looked her over with a single, practiced glance. Inside the lobby, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and cool marble. She felt intensely aware of her own attire, the worn jeans and functional, unglamorous jacket, a stark contrast to the sleek, silent figures gliding around her, all tailored suits and expensive briefcases. She presented her key fob to the doorman, who, after a brief, silent confirmation on his terminal, gestured her towards the elevator bank. The studio apartment was on the 35th floor. As the elevator ascended, the pressure difference was noticeable, a faint pop in her ears. When the doors opened, she found the hallway to be unnervingly quiet, plushly carpeted to absorb all sound. She located her unit, 3507, and used the fob. The door clicked softly open, revealing a space that was exactly as described, modern, minimalist, and cold. The liaison was already waiting. He was a man in his late 40s named Mr. Park, dressed in an immaculate dark grey suit, his hair slicked back. He stood rigidly by the immense window that offered a stunning, dizzying view of the city, only slightly inferior to Ji-hoon's own. He didn't smile, and his hands were clasped precisely behind his back, a posture of respectful but absolute authority. "Ms. Brooks," Mr. Park began, his English heavily accented but precise. His voice was smooth, devoid of any discernible warmth. "Welcome. I am Mr. Park, the primary liaison for the security consultancy funding your new assignment at the community center." He gestured around the apartment with a quick, economical sweep of his hand. "Everything is prepared. Your belongings have been unpacked and placed in the storage units. We believe efficiency is paramount." Imani felt a chill despite the apartment's regulated temperature. The quick unilateral unpacking felt like an invasion, a definitive statement that her privacy was non-existent. She focused on his face, noting the minute tension around his eyes, a sign of constant vigilance. "Thank you, Mr. Park. I would like the details regarding the center's security integration. I need to understand my responsibilities immediately." Mr. Park produced a slim black tablet from an inner jacket pocket. "Your core function remains administrative oversight for the center, but you will also be the conduit for all sensitive communications regarding the donor's interests. Specifically, you will be reporting directly to Mr. Lee's personal assistant, beginning tomorrow morning. This apartment is maintained by our staff and the communication systems are highly secured." He placed the tablet on the kitchen counter, its surface reflecting the neon cityscape. "Welcome to your new life, Ms. Brooks. Discretion, as you know, is the only currency that matters." The approfondimento do mundo was complete. She was officially within the orbit of the Mafia boss, her role defined, her dependence absolute. Mr. Park paused, allowing the weight of the last statement to settle in the clean, sterile air. His eyes, dark and assessing, held Imani's for a moment longer than necessary before he continued, shifting his weight subtly. His hands, now released from their clasp behind his back, moved with precise, controlled gestures as he walked towards the small dining table. "There are nuances to your position, Ms. Brooks, which go beyond the center's daily operations," Mr. Park stated, his voice dropping slightly, forcing Imani to lean in to hear him over the faint, almost melodic hum of the central heating. He pulled out a chair but did not sit, maintaining the rigid formality of their interaction. "The consultancy is very interested in the demographic profile of the center's clients, specifically those who demonstrate potential for future self-sufficiency. You will provide monthly, detailed but anonymized reports on the patterns of the women seeking aid, their vulnerabilities, their connections, their immediate needs." Imani felt a wave of icy comprehension wash over her. Ji-hoon was not simply being philanthropic. He was leveraging the community center as an intelligence hub, a means to gather granular data on a vulnerable population. The community center, her one refuge of genuine purpose, was being twisted into an appendage of his network, and she was the designated spy. Her hands, resting on the back of the chair, curled into tight fists under the table's edge. "Anonymized, you understand," Mr. Park emphasized, noticing her sudden rigid posture. "We are not interested in names, merely patterns, the patterns of desperation, of need. These reports are strictly for risk assessment and strategic planning. You will be provided with proprietary software on this tablet to handle the encryption and submission." He tapped the tablet's glossy surface once with a manicured fingernail, the sound sharp and metallic. Imani finally broke her silence, her voice deliberately measured, seeking clarification without raising suspicion. "And what does this strategic planning entail, Mr. Park?" He permitted a small, humorless upward curve of his lips. "That is not your concern, Ms. Brooks. Your concern is data integrity and discretion. The center is being protected and subsidized heavily. In return, we require clarity on the landscape of operations. Your success in this role is directly tied to the continued financial health of the center and, implicitly, your own." He let that unspoken threat hang between them, a heavy, velvet-lined anvil. He then moved toward the apartment's main door, retrieving a large, thick envelope from a leather satchel he had placed near the entrance. "Inside this envelope, you will find keys, documentation for the employment contract, which is highly generous, and your initial expense stipend. The first month's salary has also been wired to a newly established account in your name, which you will access via the instructions inside." Imani realized she had no choice but to accept the physical evidence of her compromise. This was the obstacle one, desafio pratico, the demand to actively betray the trust of the community she sought to serve, transforming her into a necessary cog in his machinery. She had to become the mole. Mr. Park gave a final, stiff nod. "I trust your professional background in silence will serve you well, Ms. Brooks. Your first communication directive will arrive tomorrow at 9 a.m. And with that, he was gone, the heavy apartment door clicking shut behind him, leaving Imani alone in the overwhelming silence of her newly acquired luxurious prison. The moment the door sealed, Imani rushed to it, not to escape, but to double-check the lock. The click was solid, but she knew the physical barrier was meaningless against the resources arrayed against her. She moved immediately to the windows, testing the seals and examining the view. The height was dizzying, and the city lights below looked like scattered jewels, beautiful but cold. She was trapped in the aesthetic of high-stakes power. She turned her attention to the apartment itself. She walked slowly, methodically, running her hands along the sleek surfaces, searching for any telltale signs of surveillance. She checked behind paintings, beneath the thick minimalist furniture, and inside the vents. Everything was too perfect, too integrated. She knew the technology available to men like Ji-hoon Lee meant that listening devices could be woven into the drywall or even the fabric of the expensive curtains. Her best defense was to assume that every word spoken here was being recorded and analyzed. The envelope lay on the counter where Mr. Park had left it, thick and white against the dark granite. She approached it with a sense of dread, like handling a venomous snake. She opened it, the crisp sound of the paper tearing unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside were indeed the apartment keys, the dense legal documents of her employment, and a stack of crisp Canadian $100 bills, the initial stipend. The sight of the money, more cash, than she had held at one time in her life, was momentarily disarming. It represented freedom from the gnawing stress of poverty, a freedom she had ironically traded for a different, more profound kind of servitude. She skimmed the employment contract. The salary was astronomical for a non-profit administrative role, confirming her suspicions. The clause detailing the consultancy relationship was vague, using boilerplate language about data protection and security audits. It was legally sound, but morally hollow. The fine print was silent on the actual sinister mandate of intelligence gathering. She put the documents and the cash into the deep pocket of her jacket. She wouldn't hide them in the apartment, knowing they could be searched. Then she retrieved the ceramic elephant from her newly placed essentials box. She sat on the edge of the impeccably made bed, the mattress conforming to her weight with unnerving efficiency. Holding the elephant, she allowed herself a single moment of internal vulnerability. How long could she maintain this masquerade? She was now an active participant in his world, forced to leverage the vulnerabilities of others for his strategic gain. The sheer contradiction between her job at the center, helping women escape exploitation, and her new role, cataloging potential assets for exploitation, was a crushing moral burden. This was the first brutal challenge: how to navigate her position without completely sacrificing her integrity. She had to become adept at giving him meaningless data, at protecting the vulnerable while appearing to collaborate fully. She had to survive the night, knowing that her life was no longer her own, but rather a carefully monitored, expensive piece of his sprawling, invisible empire. The silence of the apartment stretched into the night, broken only by the distant, rhythmic whirring of the city's unseen infrastructure and the occasional sigh of the building settling. Imani didn't attempt to sleep. Sleep felt like a dangerous surrender of control. Instead, she methodically began to study the tablet left by Mr. Park. It was custom-built, heavily encrypted, and contained the proprietary software for her data collection. The interface was stark and professional, labeled Project Chiron. The reporting template was meticulous, requesting metrics that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with risk and resource allocation. It asked for categories like reported economic leverage, points, family dependencies, number of minors, elders, and chillingly, known history of undocumented migration or legal vulnerability. This confirmed her fear. Ji-hoon was compiling a detailed matrix of exploitable weakness within the city's underclass. She spent 2 hours analyzing the data fields, trying to map out a strategy for obfuscation. Her goal was to feed the system enough plausible, generic data to satisfy the consultancy, while ensuring that no actual, actionable intelligence that could harm the center's clients was ever submitted. She had to become fluent in the language of bureaucratic deceit. Around 1 a.m., driven by a deep, gnawing hunger that her anxiety had previously suppressed, she ventured into the immaculate, stocked kitchen. Mr. Park's efficiency extended to groceries. The refrigerator was filled with organic produce and high-end staples. The sheer contrast between the luxury surrounding her and the grim task ahead was dizzying. She prepared a simple meal, scrambled eggs and toast, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She ate standing up, still unwilling to relax into the opulence. As she ate, her gaze fell upon the city view. Her previous life in the basement apartment felt impossibly distant, separated by more than just geography. The life she had known was grounded in hard work and visible struggle. This new life was built on secrets, silence, and soft lies. The most potent secret, however, remained the link between her and the man who controlled her gilded cage, the shared agony of infertility. She imagined Ji-hoon Lee, high above her on the 57th floor, perhaps also awake, perhaps reviewing his own strategies, his own failures. Did he ever pause in his ruthless pursuit of power to consider the profound, quiet shame of his diagnosis? The empathy she felt was a treacherous emotion. It complicated her fear and gave him a terrible, unintended human dimension. It was this dimension that she knew, instinctively, would be either her only weapon or her eventual downfall. She had accepted the immediate physical challenge, obstacle 1. Now she prepared for the next layer, the psychological warfare of proximity and moral compromise. The next morning arrived with a clinical precision that matched the apartment's aesthetic. Imani woke at the automated alarm set by the apartment's smart system, a gentle, escalating synthetic chime that was far removed from the jarring buzz of her old clock. She dressed carefully in the new, simple business casual attire that had been thoughtfully supplied and hung in the closet. Dark trousers and crisp, neutral blouses, clothing designed to signal professional competence and utter lack of personality. At exactly 9 a.m., the tablet vibrated silently on the counter. A secure encrypted message appeared on the screen, labeled Priority Directive Alpha 1. The sender's name was listed simply as M. Han, Operations. This, Imani deduced, was Ji-hoon's personal assistant, the designated point of contact. The message was brief and shocking. It wasn't a request for data or an instruction for the center. It was a scheduling change. M. Han, Operations. Due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts, the administrative oversight meeting for Project Chiron, originally planned for next month, has been moved to this afternoon. You are required to be at the donor's private residence at 4 p.m. today. A secure vehicle will collect you from the main lobby at 3:45 p.m. Attire: formal, conservative. Prepare a brief 2-minute verbal introduction outlining your immediate priorities for the center's security transition. Confirmation of receipt is mandatory. Imani felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. This was too fast. She had expected weeks, perhaps months, to establish her cover and prepare her defense. Instead, she was being summoned back to the 57th floor within 24 hours of her promotion, not as the invisible cleaner, but as an integral, visible part of his network. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the apartment's unsettling quiet. She typed a single-word response: confirmed. The remainder of the morning was a blur of frantic preparation. She reviewed the vague security protocol documents, synthesizing a plausible, innocuous explanation of her plans for the center, focusing on fire safety drills and inventory management, utterly ignoring the intelligence mandate. She spent an agonizing hour selecting an outfit, a tei, simple black shift dress and low heels, conservative enough to meet the formal requirement without drawing attention to herself. The greatest challenge was the psychological one. She had to transition from the terrified servant to the confident professional administrator. She practiced her introduction aloud, listening for any waver in her voice, watching her reflection in the window pane. Her hands, usually so expressive in her nervousness, had to be controlled. She placed them flat on the countertop, grounding herself in the cold granite. At 3:45 p.m. she walked down to the lobby. The same silent doorman ushered her to a waiting black SUV idling at the curb. The vehicle was identical to the one that had observed her at the bus stop the previous morning. The driver, a muscular man with an earpiece, nodded curtly. As the SUV pulled smoothly into traffic, heading directly for the skyscraper she had cleaned just 2 nights before, Imani felt a cold clarity settle over her. She was walking back into the predator's den, and this time she had to play his game. The drive was short, silent, and felt intensely observed. Imani sat ramrod straight in the plush leather seat, the car's highly polished interior reflecting the late afternoon sun in blinding flashes. She focused on the smell of the interior, expensive leather, and a faintly sterile, almost surgical cleanliness that was characteristic of Ji-hoon's entire domain. She practiced controlled breathing, a technique she used to manage panic attacks during her hardest shifts. The SUV didn't stop at the main entrance of the tower, but instead descended into a private subterranean garage, far removed from the public access points. The air in the concrete bunker was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of exhaust and specialized motor oil. The car parked in a designated marked slot, and the driver immediately opened the door for her. The transition from the garage to the private residence was swift, guided by 2 impeccably dressed security personnel who moved with silent, synchronized efficiency. They bypassed the public elevators entirely, leading her instead to a small private lift encased in dark, brushed titanium. The security men maintained a deliberate distance, their hands clearly visible at their sides, a posture meant to convey security rather than aggression, though the effect was the opposite. The elevator ascended with dizzying speed, making her ears pop again. There were no floor numbers. The panel simply indicated residence. When the doors hissed open, she was on the 57th floor again, but in the residential wing, a space she had only ever seen from a distance during her cleaning rounds. The atmosphere was dramatically different from the cold efficiency of the office. The light was softer, filtered through heavy, dark wood screens. The air was scented with a subtle, earthy incense, and the soundscape was dominated by the faint, elegant trickle of a hidden water feature. It felt less like an apartment and more like a private modern temple, austere, rich, and slightly menacing. Emir Han, Ji-hoon's assistant, materialized immediately. She was a woman in her late 20s, immaculately put together in a severe skirt suit, her expression tightly controlled. She offered Imani a slight, almost imperceptible dip of her head. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for your punctuality. Mr. Lee is waiting in the main drawing room." Monsieur Han's hands were folded neatly in front of her, and she carried a slim notebook, ready to record. Imani followed Mahan through a long, polished hallway lined with abstract expressionist art. Her footsteps, even in low heels, felt loud on the pristine hardwood. She focused on Mahan's back, noting the perfection of her tailored fabric, the silent movement. Every detail here screamed of deliberate, high-level control. Finally, Monsieur Han paused outside a large set of sliding rice paper doors, pausing for a moment that seemed intentionally designed to heighten the suspense. "Remember your brief, Ms. Brooks," Monsieur Han murmured, before tapping softly on the doorframe. "Mr. Lee, Ms. Brooks is here." The doors slid open with a whisper of wood on track, revealing the drawing room. Ji-hoon Lee was not at his desk. He was standing by the massive window, bathed in the sharp golden light of the setting sun, looking down over the city he owned, metaphorically and literally. He turned, and for the first time, Imani saw him not as a fleeting figure in the dark, but in full daylight, the severity of his features magnified, the quiet power radiating from him like heat. Ji-hoon Lee was dressed in dark, formal Korean attire, a modernized hanbok in rich navy silk that somehow only amplified his air of remote authority. He held a delicate, thin-stemmed glass of amber liquid, which he swirled lazily, watching the refraction of the setting sun. His face, usually shadowed and severe, was now harshly illuminated, revealing the sharp cut of his jawline and the intense focus in his dark eyes. Monsieur Han performed a shallow, formal bow and then discreetly retreated, leaving Imani alone to face the architect of her new reality. The immense room was almost silent, save for the distant gurgle of the water feature and the faint clinking sound of ice against glass as Ji-hoon stopped swirling his drink. Imani walked forward 2 steps, deliberately stopping at a respectful professional distance. She kept her hands loosely folded in front of her, mirroring Monsieur Han's formality, ensuring her body language conveyed respect without subservience. She forced herself to meet his eyes, recalling the shared knowledge that had bound them 2 nights prior, the vulnerability of the diagnosis. This memory was her only shield. "Mr. Lee," Imani began, her voice clear and controlled, exactly as she had practiced. "Thank you for the opportunity. I have reviewed the initial framework for Project Chiron." Ji-hoon took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes